Good morning and welcome to the class. In our last class, we learnt about the importance of reproduction. In fact, we also learnt that whether it is a single-celled organism or a multicellular organism, a prokaryote or a eukaryote, every organism strives to divide, increase in number, and have their offsprings, right? We learnt about the asexual reproduction, the types of asexual reproduction like fission, binary fission, budding, fragmentation, and not only that, we also happen to discuss more on what vegetative propagation is and why vegetative propagation can be considered as a part of asexual reproduction, right? So in today's class, let us go further and talk about sexual reproduction. Now, one thing that we need to always remember is that sexual reproduction is a method of reproduction which came much later in evolution, when we wanted not only the similarities but also some kind of differences uh, that can be easily formed in an organism. Okay, and that led to the kind of evolvement of sexual reproduction. Now, one major characteristic of sexual reproduction is that always there is something called as the gametes that are formed. Okay. Now, what gametes are? Gametes are basically a special type of cells. Now, these special type of cells have the ability to fuse and form one cell. Okay. So, basically we have two cells, uh, we call them as the gametes, and these gametes would form, and once they fuse, we call it as a single cell, and that single cell will give rise to an organism, right? So we have gametes, and these gametes we have two types. We have uh, one gamete. Most of the species, both in plants and animals, we see that this gamete is very small and motile, and such a gamete is what we call as the male gamete. And there is generally, in most of the organisms, we will have one larger huge gamete which is called as the female gamete. Okay, so this gametes are formed, and our sexual reproduction involves with the fusion of these two gametes, right? Now these gametes can be from the same organism, or they can be from the different organisms. So there might be one single organism having both the sexes, or many times we see that there is one organism having only one type of sex present in them. I'm sure in your last year you have studied about the typical flower, and the typical flower has the anther as well as which produces the pollen, and there is also the female gametophyte, the style, stigma, uh, and the ovule, right? So there is both a male gamete and the female gamete in a single flower, and the single plant therefore has both the male part and the female reproductive part, right? Now such organisms which have two sexes present in them already, we call such uh, organisms as bisexual. Okay, so we call such organisms as bisexual. So each organism has two sexes present in them, whereas in many others you see something like unisexual, where uh, we have only one sex present in one organism, right? So they are called as the unisexual organisms. Now the whole of sexual reproduction completely revolves around the fusion of these gametes, right? So there has to be a male gamete and the female gamete. If it is from the same organism, or if it is from the different organism, it does not bother us much, because finally the whole of reproduction, the whole of the offspring formation that happens is dependent on the fusion of these gametes, right? Fusion is a very important process in sexual reproduction. right? And because this whole process of making the gametes, those gametes to get mature, and those gametes to fuse at the right time, right? And then that fused cell to grow into a completely new organism is a very, very long, very complex, at the same time, uh, a very slow process. Okay, if it's asexual reproduction, uh, if you take bacteria, if you take one bacteria, in exactly 20 minutes, you see that a bacteria doubles. So if I take E. coli, E. coli would double every 20 minutes. Whereas if we are talking about something like sexual reproduction, you see that such fast division, cell division, would not happen. Mainly because here we are talking about so many parameters. Now comes one more interesting part. Now after fusion, you know, what we get is a new offspring, right? Now in all the asexual form of reproduction, the offspring is just identical to that of the parent. Whereas in the case of sexual reproduction, you see that the offspring is not exactly identical to the parent, but it is slightly different. It is belonging to the same species, but it exhibits a very small amount of deviation, a very small amount of changes, uh, because of lot of changes that would happen when there is fusion, and at the same time also in the expression. So that's a very important and nice study which we would be studying in our genetics chapter. Nevertheless, as of now, you can just know that the offspring is not similar to that of the parents. Okay. Now, which organisms would undergo sexual reproduction? Now, most of the higher organisms, say like fungi or the plants or the animals, all this show sexual reproduction. In fact, it is because of this reason that we say that they exhibit different structures. Okay, you see that there is a change in their structures which we call as the external morphology, right? There is external morphology that happens, and not only outside, okay, even inside you see that there is enough change. So we have changes in internal structure, there is changes in the internal physiology and various other aspects in the organisms. Okay, so for example, if you just consider ourselves, we know that a male body is different from the female body, right? Uh, then you see the internal structure is different, the physiology is different, the hormones are different, right? So many things would be different, though you see that there are many similar patterns already that are present, right? Okay, now let us try to study about some of the major characteristics of sexual reproduction. Now whenever we are talking about sexual reproduction, just like as we see in our asexual reproduction, you should know that sexual reproduction does not happen throughout. Okay, from the birth to death, that does not happen. In fact, that was the whole reason of introducing the concept of lifespan. An organism, be it a plant or be it an animal, is sexually active only for a specific period of time. That's the period of time when their body is quite strong, their you know uh, the one which we spoke of, the physiology is good, okay, and most of the other parameters are all good, and their gametes are produced regularly, right? Now that period of growth which where an organism is ready to divide, we call that as the reproductive phase. That phase in the lifespan where the organism is kind of well versed and is ready to produce the gamete or the gametes, we call that phase as the reproductive phase. But reproductive phase does not start from birth. Always it is followed, uh, it comes after one more phase which we call as the juvenile phase. Okay, we call that phase as the juvenile phase, and in plants we call that as the vegetative phase. Okay, now this juvenile phase or the vegetative phase is that phase where the organism is trying to grow, the organism is trying to build up, okay, with all the requirements for the organism to divide. Now such a phase is what we call as the juvenile phase or the vegetative phase. Now, depending on the organism, depending on the organism's lifespan, the juvenile phase or the vegetative phase changes. Okay, so in humans, this juvenile phase is somewhere between 12 to 13. Let us not worry about what the court decides, but biologically speaking, this is till the mark of puberty, which is around 12 to 14 years. So that is the juvenile phase or the vegetative phase. Now, after that is the reproductive phase. Now, reproductive phase is generally you see that it's quite long. That's the time when the body makes the gametes, and we also see that after a period of after a certain period, the plant or an animal would reduce the making of the gametes, so it does not produce enough gametes, the male or the female gametes, and finally then that is the time when the metabolism slows down and the plant or an animal would enter into a slumber phase of growth and would die, right? So this is how the phase of reproduction is not always there. It is being followed uh, after vegetative phase. You see the reproductive phase, and then comes the old age, right? Now I'm sure you would have seen some of the trees in your area. Okay, generally, especially during this period, when in March, where after Yugadi, you see that most of the trees would kind of give nice beautiful fruits and flowers, say like mango, right? After that cold season, in the Chaitra Masa, which happens to come sometime in March, you see that there is, you see mangoes only in certain period of time, or maybe you will see jasmine flowers only in the month of July and August, right? So you see that they're all seasonal, right? But however, you also see some of the flowers like mm, kakda, which comes throughout the year, right? And some of them which come once in 6 months. Say if you are talking about vegetables like radish, they you are seeing that they are biannual. That is, every 6 months or 5 months, you see that you get the crop of radish. Okay, so this shows that we are talking about plants or we are talking about animals. We have two different phases. The first phase, which we are all normally associate that with the reproductive phase. The reproductive phase is the time where the flowers actually have, so the trees will have fruits and flowers, and they would like to divide. And then there is also one more, which is called as the senescent phase. Okay, now senescent phase, you see that the plant kind of slows down in its growth. And please remember, along with these two, we have another set of plants which we call as perennial. Perennial is present all the time, and many times it becomes very difficult for us to tell what kind of phase they are in, right? Just to give you one example about seasoning, I'm sure you have learnt about one flower called as Brahma Kamala, or we call it as Neelakuranji or something. It's called as Strobilanthus kunthiana. Now, that blooms, uh, you know, uh, that gives out flowers once in 12 years. Okay, Brahma Kamala doesn't do that. There is one more variant of Strobilanthus which gives every year, only once in a year. It flowers only once in a year. So you see that certain plants will flower only once in 12 years. Some of them flower only once in a year, and some of them which keep flowering all the time. Okay, Uh, so this is about how the plants different phases are kind of characterized just by looking at them. Okay. Now the same thing as we saw in the reproductive phase and the senescence phase, we also see in animals. We all of us know that animals, they reproduce, and especially if you're talking about vertebrates, vertebrates do reproduce, giving birth, right, giving birth or laying eggs, whatever. Now when they do so, you see that they follow a very specific pattern. They follow a very specific pattern, and if you just observe it very carefully, all these organisms that we generally talk here are all higher animals. They lay eggs or they give rise to young ones. Okay, please do remember that there is a very specific period in their lifetime which we call as the reproductive phase, and generally after the reproductive phase, there is a process of growing old, which is generally considered as the end of reproductive phase. Okay, now just like how plants show different phases, even animals show different phases. I'm sure you have studied in your earlier classes about many changes that would happen in human body during puberty, right? Similar changes would also be seen in many other non-primate mammals like cows or deers or dogs or whatever. Okay, now all the animals which are in this reproductive phase, they undergo some kind of changes. They undergo some kind of changes. Okay, in various non-primate animals, we call that as the estrous cycle. Okay, when they are in the reproductive phase, they follow something called as the estrous cycle, where there are some ducts, there are some ovaries, there are some hormones, and all this is going to bring about some kind of physiology change in the organisms. And all these physiology changes would help in the formation of the gametes that we spoke of. And in the gametes, once the gametes are formed, you see that they would fuse, right? This is what happens in many animals. However, in primates, we do not see any kind of estrous cycle, but there is the menstrual cycle. Okay, now this is generally seen in most of the primates, where we do not have a very specific uh, time to breed. Okay, there is nothing like a season. It's not like what we see in the estrous cycle, where there is a specific favorable season for the reproduction. Okay, in mammals it is active throughout the reproductive phase, and they are kind of group belonging to the continuous breeders. Okay, and thus you see there is a completely different mechanism of the fusion of gametes that can be brought about. So this is how you see that when we're talking about sexual reproduction, it shows lot of variations, lot of diversity, and at the same time this is something which is more advantageous to nature than the asexual reproduction. Now, just by asking you this particular question, I would like to have a discussion sometime in our live class on if sexual reproduction is very advantageous for all the organisms, why is it that there still exists asexual reproduction, right? We generally see that this is much more easier way, giving you a lot of diversity and slight difference from the parents. All these are something which nature prefers. In that case, why exactly do we see asexual reproduction even now? Now that's a question to ponder, and we will think about the answer in our live class. Now let us see what are the events, okay, in asexual reproduction. Now, whenever we are talking about sexual reproduction, I think I have clearly mentioned it to you that sexual reproduction is a very elaborate process. Okay, there are so many similarities, there are so many differences. Uh, it's very complex, right? But if you notice, there is always a regular sequence, be it in a plant or be it in an animal. If sexual reproduction is happening, you see that there are some changes, some phenomenon, some processes that would always occur, and this is happening one after the other as a regular sequence, right? So let us study about these events in our sexual reproduction, and these are actually categorized into three broad categories. The first category is called as the pre-fertilization events. The second one is the fertilization events, and the third one is post-fertilization events. So all the events are broadly categorized into three types. So let us see what each of these events are. Now, before there is a new offspring, we know very well what is the requirement in a sexual reproduction. The first requirement is that there has to be formation of gametes, right? And once the gametes are formed, they have to be transferred so that they can fuse, right? Now, these are a set of pre-fertilization events. Now, in pre-fertilization events, we have two important steps. The first step where there is formation of a gamete, and that is what we call as the gametogenesis. That is what we call as the gametogenesis. And the second one is a gamete transfer. Okay, so let us see what these are. Now, gametogenesis basically means that there is genesis, there is birth of the gametes, right? Now, for our convenience, we always consider these gametes, to be of two types. One which is called as the male gamete, and then we also talk about the female gamete. This is how we generally talk about the gametes. One is male, the other one is female. Please do remember that whether it is a male gamete or a female gamete, these are always haploid in nature. So what exactly do we mean by haploid? Haploid is nothing but one complete set of the genes, one complete set of the genetic material. Okay, there is one complete set, so there is one copy of the complete set of the genes. You call that as a haploid. Okay, so one male gamete will have one complete set, a female gamete also will have one complete set. Now comes the most interesting part. Now both of them have haploid genes, but not all the time, you see that their structure and size is the same. Sometimes you see that they have the same structure, size is the same, okay, and both of them will show the same characteristics. Such gametes would come and they would fuse together. Now, such gametes which are morphologically identical, we call them as isogametes. Okay, I would give you one example for this. I'm sure you would have heard of cladophora. Cladophora is a fungi. You can take most of the fungi, they produce isogametes. So we have a cladophora whose gametes would be somewhat like this, kind of a teardrop, and then what you see is that there are two flagella, exactly same size. To look, they would be the same. They will have a central nucleus here. Okay, exactly the same. So you will not know whether it is a male gamete or a female gamete, but yes, you do see that this is how they look like. Okay, this is called as isogametes, but not all the higher organisms show this isogametes. You see that their structure is different, their functions also are different. Generally, one of them is motile, one of them is non-motile. Now, such condition is what we call as a heterogametes. We call them as heterogametes. Hetero means different. So, the gametes are different. Say, for example, if we are talking about human egg, okay, human egg is circular, it is having layers on layers, and you see that this is how a female egg would look like in human beings. Okay, this is in the case of egg. Whereas if you just look at a sperm, the sperm would look completely different. So this gamete, a sperm would look very different to each other. So in humans, you see that the size is different, the size of the gametes is different, the function is also different. The egg remains in its place, whereas the sperm is motile. So that kind of condition is what we call as the uh, heterogametes. That is what we call as the heterogametes. Most of the higher organisms show heterogametes. Okay, in the case of heterogametes, the one which is large, which we consider as egg, female, is called as egg, and the male one is male gamete is called as sperm, or we also call it as antherozoid. Okay, it is called as the antherozoid. Okay, now comes uh, something that we have gametes now. But do you think that whether the same isogametes from the same organisms would fuse? Or suppose we are talking about a bisexual organism. Can you see that there is fusion of the same sperm and with the same egg? Now, yes, depending on how the plant is, whether it is a unisexual plant or an organism, unisexual organism or a bisexual organism, we would kind of, discuss very well whether self-fertilization can happen. If you remember in our last class, last year, when we learnt about the flowers, we said something called as dioecious, monoecious, then we called it as pistillate or staminate, things like that. Now, all this is basically, type of the sex organs that our flower would have, and based on that, we have classified and plants. Now, even in the case of animals, you see that there are many animals which have both the sexes present. Say, for example, if you think about earthworms, or if you would think of sponge or a tapeworm or a leech or any such lower organisms, they always have both the sexes present in one organism. So, they are all basically bisexual organisms. Okay, but we do not call it as bisexual organisms. We call them, if you remember, we call them as hermaphrodite. These are the organisms which are basically bisexual. They have both the male reproductive organ as well as the female reproductive organs. Both of them are present. So, such organisms we call them as hermaphrodites. Whereas otherwise you see most of the organisms are unisexual. Okay. Now, please do remember that all our gametes are haploid, right? So, I would like to erase this part now. Now, this is a very important thing that you need to remember. Now, what is that? Suppose I have a male gamete and a female gamete, and both of them are haploid. Please do see that one haploid gamete would later fuse with another haploid gamete, and finally the organism or the cell that would be formed out of this is always diploid, right? Now, if this offspring is diploid and if the parent is also diploid, there has to be some method where from the diploid parent it becomes a haploid gamete, and from this haploid gamete we get one more diploid offspring, right? So this is what we should get. Now, do you think that all the cells in an organism in the reproductive phase would undergo this division of diploid parent to haploid gamete? So all the cells are involved? Obviously not. Only few cells which are specialized to form gamete, few cells which are involved in reproduction. Now they are the ones which would actually undergo the formation of haploids, and such cells which are specialized to undergo mitosis only, no, sorry, which would undergo um, haploid organisms only, such cells we call them as meiocytes. Now these organisms would not undergo mitosis, but they would always undergo meiosis, and we know very well that whenever there is meiosis happening, uh, the number of chromosomes would get exactly halved, right? So one set of chromosomes only remains inside the cell, and thus a haploid gamete is formed. Now just to tell you about a curiosity thing here, you all of us, all of you know that human beings have 46 chromosomes in all their cells. Even the meiocyte would have 46 chromosomes, but after it forms a gamete it would be 23. Now just to tell you one very interesting fact here, dogs have 78 chromosomes, and the best is has butterfly has 380 chromosomes, 380. Now that's a whopping high number, but yes, that is how it is, right? So basically you see that the whole of gametogenesis starts with the identification of meiocytes, and this meiocytes identification starts very early in life. In fact, many times it is even before birth. However, you see in later in the life, these meiocytes would undergo meiosis to give the haploid gametes. The haploid gametes that are formed in the organism should fuse together, and this fusing together is what we call as fertilization. But for them to come together and fuse, there is one more step that is very, very important, and that is what I would erase this, and that is a process which we call as the gamete transfer. Now, unless and until the gamete transfer happens, there is no fusion, right? And how does the gametes really get to know that, okay, this is the male gamete, this is the female gamete, okay, now this has to fuse? Now that's a very, very complicated thing, right? And you might also be surprised that, though the organisms look like and there is slight difference in their species, let me say, I would like to think of zebra and horse. Both of them look very much like. One has stripes, one has no stripes. Okay, if I consider even such organisms, and suppose we take the sperms and eggs of these two organisms, the fusion happens so well that only the the sperms of one organism would fuse with the egg of the same species, same type, right? Now, how does this gamete transfer first happens, and then comes how this fusion happens? Okay, now most of the times whenever we are talking about sexual reproduction, we always see that one of the gametes is always motile. Okay, generally it is a male which is motile in most of the organisms. If they are isogametes, then one would be slower and the other one would be faster. Okay, most of the organisms, if they are living in water, if there are gametes, with the water current the gametes would move. Uh, However, you see that in such conditions, sometimes the male gamete cannot meet the female gamete at all. So, all such things also happen. But in spite of all that, you see there are so many organisms present, and all this happens because of some kind of chemical affinity between the sperm and the egg. Okay, so there is a very specific chemical reaction which would kind of pull the sperm towards the egg, and that pulling would finally lead to fertilization. But whatever said and done, the first thing is that the gamete has to be transferred. Okay, uh, in the case of plants, I'm sure you have studied this in your last year. You would see that there is this pollen grain. I'm sure we have spoke about the fertilization in a flower. So when there is flower, the pollen falls on the stigma. You see that the pollen grains are actually carrying the male gametes. Yes. So with the help of the male gametes, with the help of the pollen grains, the male gametes are entering into the ovule of the egg, right? So pollen grains are actually the carriers, right? And that later leads to fertilization. Whereas uh, what makes the pollen to fall on the style or stigma, now that also we have discussed. Now that can happen only because of some kind of special events like pollination. Okay, the pollination can be within the same flower or different flowers, which is brought about by so many factors like bees, insects, birds, or wind also, right? So this makes the pollen grain to fall actually on the stigma, and that will carry the male gamete to the ovule, right? Now what happens in the case of animals? Now in the case of animals also, we have a very specific male and female gametes which are formed in different individuals. Okay, now each organism has evolved with their own special mechanism for gamete transfer. For example, we have learnt in you know maybe in your very much lower classes, ninth and 10th, that a frog would lay eggs, a female frog would lay eggs, and on this eggs there would be deposition of the sperms. Okay, so in many plants that is the mechanism that would happen. Whereas in the case of higher animals, there is a slightly different, uh, altogether a very special mechanism to discharge the male gametes near the egg. And as I was telling you, that there is a lot of chemical affinities that would happen. The structure of the egg and the sperm are in sync such that the pollen would fuse with the ovule, the sperm would fuse with the egg, and finally when they are very close to each other, okay, then with this very special mechanism they would fuse together. Please do remember, I said that it is a very important step, very special event, mainly because it is not just the chromosome that gets transferred, but the entire organism would kind of be imbibed into the not the organism, one complete cell would be imbibed into another cell. So there is fusion of cytoplasm, there is fusion of the membranes, there is fusion of the nuclei later. So all this happens in a very specific manner, and this leads to our next stage, which is called as the fertilization. Now fertilization is a very critical event, very important event in sexual reproduction. In fact, we many times call this process as syngamy. Syngamy. Syn is nothing but fusion, and gamy is the gametes. So there is fusion of the gametes, and many times we generally kind of interchange fertilization with that to syngamy. So what would happen when there is syngamy, what would happen when there is fertilization is something that we should know in detail. So we will continue that in our next class. So hope you have understood this class. Basically in this whole class we try to figure out why sexual reproduction is important. We spoke about the differences that this would bring. At the same time, we also spoke about the advantages of sexual reproduction over asexual reproduction. Then we try to find out some of the most important features of sexual reproduction, talking about the reproductive phase in particular. We spoke about some of the differences that would happen both in plants and animals during the reproductive phase. And once we know what exactly are the phase changes, then comes our next part where we try to find out what are the basic steps in a sexual reproduction. So we try to find out those of them to be categorized as pre-fertilization events, fertilization, and the post-fertilization events. So what are they? What is their function? We started learning about them and try to understand the importance of gametogenesis and the gamete transfer in our class today. So in our next class, we will talk more importantly with syngamy and fertilization, and we will also finish the post-fertilization events. So I hope you have understood the class. Any doubts, please do make a note of it. We can always discuss in our live class, and I would uh, appreciate if you would ponder over the question that you've asked. If asexual reproduction is really good, is not so good than sexual reproduction, why is it still there? So what are the benefits that it's offering to those organisms to survive? Okay, so let us discuss on this in our class. See you till then. Bye.